So, if you remember last time, we looked at Virginia, New England, and the Middle Colonies. Or in effect, we looked at the development of three regions, right? Three regions. And I'm going to revisit that with this poorly written chart in a second after we get rid of these terms. We're doing a couple of things simultaneously now. We're doing a couple of things simultaneously. Number one, we're looking at the development of these colonies that are kind of unique in their own way, but also looking at their similarities. Number two, we're looking at the development of regions and how these regions are going to come to have their own identities, right? The South is going to be different than the North, is going to be different than the Mid-Atlantic colonies, as we've already seen. And of course, the West is a whole other animal a little bit later on. We also are looking at how all of this becomes the United States. And how are these folks going to become quote-unquote Americans? So we're doing a couple of things simultaneously. And it works because all of these things are contributing to that development of an American identity, even though they would not have called themselves that yet. So that's kind of what we want to work through, is how we get to that point where they're going to call themselves Americans and start behaving like Americans. So some of this will be a little bit of review, but some of it might be new information in terms of how we tie it together. So we'll use this list of terms. This first term, haphazard colonization. Haphazard colonization. What that basically means is the process of colonization for the British was kind of random. Haphazard or random. Meaning that the English did not always have a perfect blueprint, right? They did not always have a fully laid out plan as to how this would go, right? They didn't always have it all figured out ahead of time. There's going to be a lot of figuring things out on the fly, right? Now that's going to make these colonies unique. That's going to make them quite different from each other on occasion. So for example, Jamestown, as we mentioned, is founded in 1607. Well, Georgia, the colony of Georgia, is not founded until 1733. So just in terms of when they are founded, there's a 126-year gap there. Well, of course, these places are going to look different. They're founded over a century, more than a century. They're founded in different places. They're founded by different people. And so I think all of these factors will contribute to the fact that this is a haphazard process of colonization. For the English in particular, with whom we are now interested in. So the English monarchs follow no clear plan often. Right? Sometimes they're proprietary colonies. Sometimes they're founded by a joint stock company, as we've seen. Sometimes the king may grant 10 million acres to a friend of his. Right? This is really kind of random in a sense, and so I think it does contribute to differences among the colonies and among the regions. Now, this is one of the things that makes the English colonies different than the Spanish or the French or even the Portuguese. Right? Those colonial societies were usually founded by royal governments. Right? So the government knew exactly what they wanted to do, and they would implement their plan. That wasn't always the case with the British, as we've seen. Even who founds it is not always the same. At the same time, the English do have a kind of unifying policy, and you heard this mentioned in the crash course video. Right? This policy of mercantilism. He mentioned mercantilism, so I want to say a little bit about mercantilism now, and we'll see it again here in a second. This policy of mercantilism is part economic, and it's really part politics. Ultimately, it is about control. Right? The English want control of their colonies. They feel like they founded us to benefit the mother country. England did not found these colonies so that they would one day become independent and great and bigger than England. Right? That was not the goal at all. They founded them so that they can benefit the mother country, so that they can help England compete with other European rivals, right? And ultimately outpace them. We're supposed to be part of an empire. We're supposed to help the mother country. That's why we existed. But we're going to start to challenge that relationship in this period, right? And ultimately, you can argue that us challenging that relationship will lead to the American Revolution. So that's what we're tracing now. So what is this policy of mercantilism? Technically, mercantilism is viewing the colonies as a source of raw materials. So you heard that in the video, right? They view us as a source of raw materials and as a market for British goods. Right, so we're a source of raw materials. We're supposed to grow, say, cheap tobacco, cheap cotton. send it back to the mother country, benefit the mother country. But we're also supposed to buy products back from the mother country. So imagine this, first tobacco and then later cotton is going to become a major crop in the South, of course. We'll talk more about that. But say you're a cotton farmer. You grow all this cotton, send it back to the mother country at a discounted rate. Now, why would you do that? Why would you give a discounted rate? Well, because you're a good Englishman. You're patriotic. Right? What does it mean to be patriotic? Right? You have a certain connection and love for the country. And in your view, that means giving the mother country a better deal. Right? We'll talk more about patriotism and how subjective patriotism might be in different moments and in different places and from different perspectives. But mercantilism argued that these colonies should do this. So we give them a cheap deal on cotton. Then we are expected to buy back cotton shirts after Britain produces them. So imagine you're a farmer, a cotton farmer, and you're like, wait a second, I'm growing the cotton, sending it to you at a discount, and then buying your shirts at full price? That doesn't make any sense. You're taking money out of my pocket twice. So some are going to start to question that relationship. Now again, even questioning that relationship, I argue, might be the beginning of an American identity. Because if you just are a good Englishman, loyal and patriotic, whatever for the mother country, you don't question it. You just do it. But if you feel like this is not in your interest, right, like you're already thinking in terms of imagined community, you're already thinking in terms of an American identity, even though it's going to take a long time to really get there, as we will see. So this process of mercantilism, viewing colonies as a source of raw materials and as a market for finished goods. Right? As we're going to see, though, and as we already have seen, these policies of mercantilism, the laws, like last time we talked about that Act of Trade and Navigation in 1651, they've been there forever, but they were not always enforced. Right? They had been on the books for a long time, but they were not always enforced. Now what's going to happen? Well, after the 7 Years' War, Britain is going to start to enforce them. Right? And when they try to enforce them after so long, having not enforced them, we're going to have a reaction to that. We're going to have an attitude about that. Yes?
When did you say they established the
That Act of Trade and Navigation, there were several of them, but the one we mentioned briefly last time was 1651. We're going to talk about some more in the 1660s here in a second. But the main point is it's a long time before the Revolution, like more than a century. And from Britain's perspective, I think they were a little bit surprised. They're like, what are y'all mad about? These laws have been here for 100 years, right? But from our perspective, after the 1760s, we're going to be like, you're trying to hold us down. You're trying to oppress us. All right, we feel like, let me give you an everyday example. I think I've given you this example already. My son, I have an 8-year-old son. Last night he was staying up. It was 11:30. Right, he was under the blanket watching his YouTube videos and people jumping off of stuff and doing crazy stuff, way past his bedtime. Right? And now it's summertime, so he can kind of stay up, when he wants. Technically, his bedtime is 7:30, 8 o'clock. He's staying up till 11:30, midnight. Sometimes I fall asleep and wake up like, hey, dude, you gotta go to sleep. Right? Go brush your teeth. Use the bathroom, brush your teeth. He'll have an attitude, right? Oh, man. I'm like, dude, it's midnight. You're 4 hours past your bedtime. You would think he'd be happy. Right? He got all this bonus time. Now, when school starts, he has to go to bed 7:30, 8 o'clock. Right? It's going to be an issue to get him back on that schedule. Because he's like, I'm used to staying up till 11:30. Right? All of a sudden now I got to go to sleep at 8. But I'm going to say, your bedtime has always been, 8 o'clock. So yeah, but you weren't making me go to bed at 8 o'clock. You weren't enforcing it. Now it feels oppressive. It's exactly the same way this relationship with the mother country and the colonies as her children, same way that relationship's going to go. Yes, those rules had always been there, but they had not always been enforced. When they are enforced, it's going to feel oppressive. It's going to feel like they're doing something to us that's unfair. And we're going to react against that. We're going to start to resist it. And eventually, it's going to lead to conflict. Right? So perhaps we're already on the road to civil war, even though we don't know about it, even though we don't realize it. So one of the outcomes of this haphazard approach was something called long periods of benign neglect. Long periods of benign Neglect. What does that term neglect mean? What does it mean to neglect something? Ignore it. Yeah. That's a good synonym. What else? You're neglecting me. If you're in a relationship and someone says you're neglecting me, you better address it. You may no longer be in a relationship. What does that mean? To deny acceptance. Okay, yeah, you're not treating them fairly, equally in a sense, right? You're not respecting their wishes in a sense, perhaps. You're forgetting about them. You forgot my birthday, right? You're neglecting me. Well, this term, benign neglect, is a little bit different in that England seems to forget about her colonies for long periods of time. But it's benign to us. We actually like it. We're glad when England forgets about us. England is 3,000 miles away. So we're glad when they're not all in our business. Think about a parent-child relationship. My son is glad that we're neglecting his bedtime right now. But eventually, come August, September, it's time to go to school. Hey, you got to go to sleep. It's like, it's still light outside. I refuse, right? We may have a little revolution in the house. Now, I'm going to win. But we may have a little revolution in the house, right? Because he feels like it's oppressive. Now, benign is also a medical term, right? If you know anything about tumors, for instance, benign and malignant tumors, there's a difference between them, right? A malignant tumor is dangerous, cancerous. A benign one, you can deal with it, right? It's not so bad. It's not so bad. So we are happy with the fact that England forgets about us for long periods of time. Why? Why does England forget about us? Well, England has their own issues going on. We talked about the English Civil War. Right? When England is in civil war, they're not worried about what we're doing 3,000 miles away. They're dealing with their own issues. Right? When England's at war with France in the old world or someone else, they're more concerned. They're preoccupied with other things. But eventually they deal with that and they're like, okay, let's reorganize. Let's get things together. Let's crack down. That's when they're going to have this kind of tipping point, these issues. That term neglect is often a legal term as well. Every now and then you'll turn on the news, say Channel 8, Channel 9, whatever, and you'll hear this story about child neglect. The story might go something like this. 2 young parents in LA decided to go to Vegas. You're like, okay, good for them. They're working hard. They're parents. So they decided to go to Vegas, but they decided they didn't want to bring their kids. Okay, I understand that. You can't take them in the casino. That kind of puts a damper on your Vegas trip. So, okay, they went to Vegas without kids. Why is that a crime? Why is that on the news? Well, they leave the kids in the apartment. Let's say all 3 children, one age 5, one age 3, one age 1. And they tell the 5-year-old, okay, you're in charge. There's some hot dogs in the fridge. I had some ketchup and mustard. It's Friday. We'll be back Monday morning, right? Don't open the door for strangers, right? Of course, they tell the child that because they're good parents, right? Well, they leave. They roll out. Well, what happens Saturday? The 5-year-old's in charge. Our 5-year-old is taking care of the little ones, right? So he or she is hooking them up with hot dogs. And they run out, or they run out of ketchup. So the 5-year-old, being a responsible young person in charge of the house at this point, goes next door and knocks on the door. Neighbor opens the door. They're like, "Oh my goodness! Hey, is that little Joey, little Sarah? What are you doing? Where's your mom? Oh, she went to Vegas. You okay? Like, yeah, I just need some ketchup. All right, we're cool. I need some ketchup. We ran out. The neighbor's like, you need ketchup? Your mom's in Vegas? Is that what you said? Yes. What happens next? 911, right? Neighbor calls 911. Why? Because that's child neglect. You can't leave your kids like that and just roll out. You can't do it. It's against the law. So what happens when those parents come back from Vegas? Even if they want a bunch of money, they're about to have a bad day, right? Police are waiting for them. Social services probably there, right? They've broken the law. Now the difference here is we as colonial children were happy that England forgot about us. We're happy they were in Vegas. Same thing happened to me. I was like 14 or 15 years old. My mom went on a cruise. She's like, I'm going on a cruise. I was like, yeah. She's like, you're not going? I was like, I know. So I'm thinking everything I can do in the house. I'm like, cool, okay, you got school Friday. I'm going to get about 3 pizzas. Right? I wasn't going to have a party or anything. I wouldn't do that. That's disrespectful. But then my mom's like, yeah, you're going to go stay with Mr. Macon. I'm like, what? I was kind of offended. Like, what do you... I don't need a babysitter. I'll be driving next year. What are you talking about? Like, what? She's like, yeah, you're going to go. I'm like, he lives across the street. If something happens, the house is on fire, he can come put it out. What are you talking about? I was so offended. I was kind of hurt. But I had to go stay with Jamaican, right? My mom was like, nah, I'm leaving for a week. I'm not leaving you here. I'm not leaving you here. I was upset about that. I felt like I was independent enough to make my own decisions, take care of myself. This is how the colonies are starting to feel. We're grown. We don't need you meddling and doing all these things. They're starting to grow up, and that relationship's going to start to change, as we'll see. So that's what benign neglect means. We like the fact that England is forgetting about us for long periods of time. So you have these long periods of benign neglect by the English. Even though these kind of 13 original colonies may have very little in common with each other, they do have one thing in common. They're all loyal to the British. Right? They're loyal to the flag. They're loyal to the king and the queen. But there are going to be these strong regional differences, as we've already started to see. Right? There's going to be some strong differences between the regions. You can argue that these regional differences will last throughout American history. They still exist. A Southern identity is different than being from the West, being from the Northeast, the Middle Colonies. So what I want to do is take a look really quickly at this chart I wrote up here in really bad writing to kind of review what we already sort of discussed in terms of these regional identities and how they're similar but also very different from each other. Let's kind of go through this really quickly in terms of what I attempted to write here. If I could write in a way that was not chicken scratch, you'd be able to read this, but instead I'll just decipher it for you. What we're going to see is that we can look at a few themes. Right? We can look at a few themes and get a sense of the region, right? And how the region is different, perhaps, from other regions. So we spent some time already comparing these regions, looking at the founding of these colonies. So we got New England, you got the sort of mid-Atlantic or middle colonies, and then we're going to have eventually what becomes the South. So in terms of New England, we're really referring to, say, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, right? New England, the Northeast. Eventually we'll call this the North, but it's not perfect descriptors yet. The Middle Atlantic colonies, we talked a bit about these last time, their founding. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, right? Those in the middle. Middle colonies or mid-Atlantic colonies. The southern colonies at this time would have been Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia. Right? So think about these three regions kind of geographically organized and how they were different environments. In some ways they developed their own kind of cultures, their own colonial cultures. So in terms of how we might compare them, what I did was put on the side a couple of themes that we can use to sort of talk through their differences. The first theme that might be significant in each region is the theme of religion. Right, so that REL, that word is supposed to be religion over there at the top. What is the religion in New England? Well, we know. What's the official religion in New England? Puritans, or the Congregationalist Church. Right? The Puritans or Congregationalists is their official name. We know that it's particularly important to their identity, right? Their religious identity. Now, in the South at this point, the official church is usually the Anglican Church, except for Maryland, of course, actually is Catholic, right? But the Anglican Church or Church of England. Right? So that's going to be one difference there. Even though we think of the South as being more of a secular society, they still do have a connection to religion or a religious identity. It's just not perhaps as extreme as the Pilgrims or the Puritans. What about the Mid-Atlantic? Well, the Mid-Atlantic, and this is going to be a common theme for the region, is pretty diverse. You're going to have a number of religious backgrounds. A place like Pennsylvania with the Quakers, for instance. A number of immigrants coming in with their own religious backgrounds that we'll talk about. So the middle colonies often are going to be in the middle between the North and the South in terms of some of these themes. But again, we can start to lay out at least some general rules, right, about how this plays out. It's not 100% right, but I think we'll at least be able to, identify some differences between the regions based on a factor like religion. Another factor is economics. Right? What are the economic systems like in these various regions? So the economy in New England we mentioned as being different than, say, Virginia. I remember the New England economy, they don't have like one merchantable commodity. They don't have one cash crop like tobacco or cotton. Initially, that might seem like a curse. Because remember, those merchantable commodities, those cash crops can get you cash. But since New England doesn't have one cash crop like that, it's forced to diversify its economy. And that may be a blessing in disguise. Right? That may be a blessing in disguise. Maybe it starts a little slower, but maybe it makes for a stronger economy overall. So what kind of economy do we have in New England? Well, we do have some small farming. You don't have the big, huge plantations of tobacco or cotton or anything, but you have some small farms. You also have a group of commercial or merchants in New England that are going to be really important, involved in trade. You have shipbuilding, you have logging and timber. Right? So you have a lot of different avenues, perhaps, for economic growth in a place like New England. Of course, that contrasts with what we tend to see in the South, because remember, that tends to be an agricultural society that's dependent on a cash crop. An agricultural society that's dependent on one cash crop. We talked about the role of tobacco, especially in Virginia and Maryland, and how the tobacco economy is the economy in many respects, how that's going to make tremendous money, right? So it's a blessing in many respects. But what happens when you have a bad year? It may lead to instability. Now, tobacco is going to be the moneymaker early on, as we've seen. Later on, we'll get to how significant cotton becomes as a crop. Cotton is going to be even bigger than tobacco. Cotton is going to be even bigger than tobacco ever was. In fact, by the time we get to the U.S. Civil War, in 1861, the South is growing 75% of the cotton on the entire planet. 75% of the world's cotton is coming from the slaves of the South by 1861. Big money, big power. Some historians will then call it king cotton because it's so powerful, it's so important economically and politically. Some say that gives the South in 1861 the fifth largest economy in the entire world among nations, and that's just one region. So this is going to be significant moving forward, this cash crop and that crop in particular. Again, the middle colonies, how are they different? Well, they're kind of in the middle. They're more diverse. Many of these middle colonies will be known as a heaven for farmers. Pennsylvania, for instance, was known as a heaven for farmers. If you were a farmer, you wanted to come get some free land, right, open, available land, you probably would come to a place like Pennsylvania before you would come to Virginia. Remember, Virginia is all, not all, but has a bunch of big plantations. Slaveholders are already in control of most of the good land. Why would you go there if you were a small farmer? You want to work for somebody else? No, you want to own your own land. Right? So these middle colonies are going to be more diverse in some respects. We're going to come back to that because that kind of dovetails to the next two sort of themes in terms of the middle colonies in particular. So these economies are really based in many ways, not just on the environment, but the culture that develops in this environment. The role of slavery. We've kind of touched on this a couple of times already. It was touched on in the video. Slavery is permitted in the Northeast. Slavery is legal in Massachusetts. We saw this with Tituba. Right? Tituba is a slave in Massachusetts, right, during the Salem witch trials. It's not until the 1800s, the early 1800s, that slavery really is mostly dead in the North, and it becomes concentrated more in the South. It was a national institution. Right? This idea of unfree labor is going to be national for us, even though it does develop later into more of a Southern kind of peculiar institution is the term that often gets used. But it was permitted, right? It was permitted in the Northeast, which is an important fact. One historian said that the North was a society with slaves, but the South was a slave society. Right? What he meant by that was that it becomes essential to the economy of the South. Right? It becomes essential to the economy of the South because of these cash crops, because of the agriculture. Right? It's not so essential to the North, which is perhaps why it can die out sooner in the North. So that's the difference. A society with slaves versus a slave society. There's a difference in emphasis, definitely in that sense. So slavery is permitted in the North, but it's not vital to the economy. Right? In the South, you have an increasingly slave-dependent and socially stratified society. You have a socially stratified society. What does that mean? What does it mean when there's a society that's socially stratified? What does that term mean, do you think? Yes.
There's like very clear divisions between classes.
Good. There are clear divisions between the classes. You have those are kind of hard and fast hierarchies, dividing lines. In the South, as we're going to see later, there's going to be a handful of folks that are increasingly wealthy, especially the largest slaveholders, who will be among the wealthiest people in the country. But there's a small number of them. But there's a whole bunch of folks at the bottom that have very little or nothing. Right? Of course, slaves fit that category. Right? They don't have anything, essentially, and they're considered property. But also, many poor whites will fit in that category. There are going to be many poor whites that have to work on the land of their neighbors because they don't have land themselves. They're broke. The only people they have more than slaves. It's going to make for an interesting dynamic, as we'll see. So it's incredibly stratified. There, of course, will be people in the middle, but there's going to be this increasing stratification or hierarchy. What about the middle colonies? It's more diverse. If you're a small farmer, you come to the middle colonies, right? You want to get a little piece of land and set up shop there. You might have some shopkeepers. You might have some that hold slaves, but not necessarily the huge plantations that you see in the South. You might have some involved in other industries, and so you have a larger middle class, perhaps, developing there. So this notion of the middle colonies as kind of being in the middle is generally a useful concept, I think, for us to understand. That stratification in the South also includes a skewed sex ratio, as we've seen. Remember early Virginia, 6-to-1 men to women. Even later on, still 3-to-1 male to female. That's going to perhaps make it harder to develop the society at first, as we have already seen. Right? Non-English immigration. What about non-English immigration? Now, first we have to say a bit about what that term even means. Non-English immigration. One of the things that makes the English colonial system fairly unique is that the English allowed settlers from other European nations to come to their colonies. Spanish, the French, and the Dutch tended not to do so much of that. The English are like, come on, they wanted to build a population, remember? So they will allow, for instance, German immigrants to come settle in Pennsylvania. They'll allow Scots-Irish and Irish folks to come. And this is going to be significant later, this non-English immigration. We're going to come back to this. But where would you go if you were a non-English immigrant? Which of the three regions do you think? The middle. Because if you weren't Puritan, you didn't want to necessarily go to New England. And if you were, say, a German farmer, most of which the German immigrants at the time were farmers, you didn't want to go to slave-controlled colonies in the South. You wanted to go to this middle colony. Pennsylvania, again, is seen as a heaven for farmers. And in addition, if you're non-English, then perhaps your religious background is non-traditional as well. It's probably not Anglican, it's probably not Puritan, it's probably something else. Think about the Quakers in Pennsylvania, for instance. So, again, these middle colonies are often more diverse than the others because of the way they were founded, because of the kind of culture that's developing. This non-English immigration is going to be important. I want you to think about why that might be. I ask you why you think it might be significant to have this non-English immigration coming to the colonies. You're going to get more ethnic diversity in many ways. Even though these non-English folks tended to come sometimes to the South, if they did come to the South, they would land and focus on the backcountry. They would be in the frontier area that weren't so developed. Remember, the land is already taken up in the old part of Virginia, right? You wanted to go someplace where you could kind of make your own American dream. But mostly they're going to come to these middle colonies. The theme of education. We talked a lot about education last time, too. What was education like in New England? What do you remember about that? How important was education in New England? Literacy rates, what about them? Very high. Right? Remember, New England is a very literate society. Education is prized. Why was that? Yeah, you want to be able to read the Bible. This notion of founding this biblical-based society may have a number of outcomes to it, may have a number of direct or indirect implications. There is a strong emphasis on education in New England. Right? In the South, there's going to be very little formal education. Relative to New England, there's very little formal education, even among the wealthy, even among the elites. You might own 300 slaves, but not necessarily have gone to college and done that sort of thing, because it's more of an agricultural society. Folks didn't see it as important. It's perhaps less of a religious society. Maybe folks didn't necessarily see it as important. Or maybe you have a private tutor at home if you're that wealthy. Right? Now, you are going to get universities built, like Thomas Jefferson will help develop the University of Virginia, for instance. But compared to New England, education levels and literacy rates will be lower. Now, in the middle colonies, there will be some formal education, not as much as New England, but more than the South. Again, it's kind of in the middle. It's kind of in the middle. So I think the middle colonies are kind of aptly named in that sense. They're both in the middle geographically, but also kind of in the middle culturally. Now, I said I'd come back to this question of non-English immigrants because we want to think about the role in the coming revolution. And I wanted you to really think about why these non-English immigrants might be sort of doubly significant in a sense. So we want to spend some time talking about them. Non-English immigration will start to increase, will start to escalate in the late 16th and early 18th centuries. So in the late 1600s, early 1700s, late 17th century, early 18th century, more and more non-English immigrants will be coming. These non-English settlers included Scots-Irish folks, Germans, of course. Right? They often settled in the less fertile backcountry areas, as we mentioned, along the Appalachian Mountains and elsewhere. Pennsylvania, perhaps down to the Carolinas. They want to carve out their own space, kind of their own imagined community. They included Germans as well. Right? Now, Germany was not consolidated as a nation yet. It's not around. That doesn't happen until around the U.S. Civil War, right, the 1800s. But German-speaking immigrants are coming. And so these Germans tended to come and tended to settle, for the most part, in Pennsylvania. It becomes known as the heaven for Germans. Most of them are farmers, small farmers. So they want to set up small farms. And they felt like this was more possible, perhaps in the more tolerant colony of Pennsylvania. New England is not that tolerant for folks that are Puritans. So these people are coming to the New World for a variety of reasons, right? One of the questions you're dealing with is, why are people coming? This may help you begin to answer that question for yourself in different ways. They might be coming for a variety of reasons, especially depending on where they land, what their background is. Maybe their reasons are different. But again, there's, I think, a couple of levels of significance to this non-English immigration and non-English population generally. Part of this conversation is you're getting a greater ethnic diversity. And especially, you're getting an increasing percentage of the population that's born here in North America. Folks that are born here in, say, Pennsylvania or Virginia or Massachusetts, as opposed to being born in London and coming over. Think about this idea of imagined community. Why might it start to make a difference that you have more folks born here that are born in the old world? Why do you think that makes a difference? Why is that significant? Any thoughts? Why might it be significant that more and more people are being born here in the colonies?
They don't have the patriotism for England as they would if they...
You're saying they're traitors because they were born here? Not necessarily, but yeah, right? If you've never seen the king or the queen, it may feel distant. It may feel theoretical to you. Like, look, I know Philadelphia. I was born in LA. I don't know anything about London. You may call yourself a loyal Englishman still and still be loyal, but your context is here. You're exactly right. Especially as more and more born, first, second, third generation Americans are already being created. Even though they're still loyal to the crown at this point, we are perhaps already on the road to revolution. Maybe just because of the fact that England is 3,000 miles away. Think about notions of imagined community, so you're exactly right. By the 1750s, maybe fewer and fewer people are considered as having as strong an affinity toward the mother country. they don't have as strong an affinity towards some other country. Now, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some things for that tipping point of the revolution to come, but perhaps we've already seen it. So this ethnic diversity, these folks being born in the New World, is actually very specific. Now, there's another two groups that contribute to this ethnic diversity that we have to sort of mention here. There is a significant percentage, about 20% of the colonial population, that's comprised of Africans or African Americans. 20%, which is actually about double the percentage of today. It's only about 11% of African Americans, somewhere in that range. So the fact that there are 20% is a major factor. I think about this in terms of notions of race that we've already been laying out. Right? 20%, especially in certain colonies like New York, Virginia. Virginia has a 40% African population at one point. South Carolina that we mentioned that actually has an African majority. Right? This is significant in terms of how we start to think of issues of race, how slavery is developing as well. Right? Certainly by about 1750, slavery had become an important institution. We traced it all the way back to those early Virginia laws long before that. The growing African populations combined with slave revolts, slave insurrections, right? Most notably the Stono Rebellion in 1739. This is going to have an impact on how folks are imagining themselves, I would argue, right? This is going to be one of those factors that perhaps is also pushing people to become more American. Think about that term American and what it might mean to folks at the time. The Stono Rebellion is a rebellion that happens in Stono, South Carolina in 1739. But this is going to terrify people in all of the colonies. Because what if that spreads? Right? What if it's not put down in South Carolina and it spreads to North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland and maybe even all the way to the north? You're going to start to have other colonies offering assistance. Hey, do you need help with that slave revolt? I would argue that this is pushing people to act like a nation. Pushing them to think beyond their colonial identities, pushing them to think beyond just what's happening in their neighborhoods. So they're essentially acting like a nation, you could argue. So there's a larger African population and there are revolts, there's resistance. We'll talk more about these issues moving forward, just to kind of put it out there. Actually, after Stono, you get harsher laws, right? The means to try to control these folks that were seen as being kind of out of control. And again, we'll talk much more about that as we get into the 1800s, especially. Now, there's only one group whose population is not growing in this period. Everybody else's population is growing. There's one group whose population is not growing. In fact, they're declining. Who is that? Native Americans. Exactly. Everybody else's population is increasing. Native American populations are decreasing. Right? They're the only ones who were not seeing growth in the 17th and 18th centuries. Some of the native societies that had encountered English settlers early on, such as the Powhatan down in the Virginia area, had virtually disappeared by 1700. Many of them had virtually disappeared. The Pequots in New England are going to be nearly destroyed in a particularly brutal conflict with the New England settlers, right? 1636, 1637. They're going to be largely wiped out. Groups like the Cherokee and Iroquois that had seen their populations cut in half, essentially. Right? Especially those societies that are along the coast that first encounter Europeans are going to suffer tremendously, mostly through disease. Remember, disease comes through and wipes out certain New World societies even before conflict may come in. But of course, conflict also will play a role. So native populations are always going to have to be figuring out what do they do, how do they resist this? How do they survive? Right, we're going to talk more about this again. We've already kind of mentioned it, but we will come back to this on several occasions. Right? They're going to try to pursue what we already termed a sort of middle ground. They're going to try to maintain a certain level of autonomy and independence. They're going to try to keep from being conquered, keep from being pushed off their lands, if at all possible. But they're going to have different ways to try to do that, and different societies would adopt different strategies to try to avoid dependency. Right? They do not want to become dependent on these new settlers, even though these settlers are really becoming powerful enough where they can start to dominate the area. Right? How do they maintain their independence and their freedom? Y'all didn't even tell me I didn't turn the screen back on. I'm thinking you're looking at these terms. It's a dark screen. I'm like, my goodness gracious. So think about how these folks are trying to maintain their imagined community. Right? We can use that imagined community concept to try to understand what Native Americans are doing, but also how what colonists are doing and what they think they're doing throughout this process. For some Native peoples, it's going to mean plain politics, right? Shrewd dealings with these newcomers. So, for example, okay, maybe you make an alliance with the new British settlers, right? Maybe you make an alliance like, look, we have some traditional Native enemies across the way. How about you give us 50 muskets for this? We'll give you this land, right, so that we can defend ourselves against our traditional enemies. And they go and fight their traditional enemies and win, right? Traditional enemies like, wait a second, they have muskets. So these traditional enemies among Native peoples now may reach out to the French. Hey, our enemies have 50 muskets. We need to get 100 muskets so we can kind of balance things out. What do we now have? An arms race, which is going to be doubly devastating, especially to Native peoples. It's even more deadly warfare, which wipes out even more Native peoples. Again, we see the Native conflicts. We sort of mentioned or outlined them briefly last time in this century, between 1689 and up to 1763 with the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War. Right, that was mentioned in the video. 1763 is going to be an important tipping point. It's going to be a very important tipping point in American history. Some say that it's the tipping point that leads to the revolution itself. But we've already traced that we already seem to be on this road. We already seem to be on this road to revolution. Maybe it goes back to the founding itself. Maybe it goes back to the very founding of these first colonies. So how do we get to this point? Well, part of it you could say, and I will argue, part of it is that these colonies are growing up. These colonies are growing up. They are going to start to question the relationship with the mother country. They're going to start to question the relationship with the mother country, as we will see.